Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to Talking to the Void. I am your friendly host, and it has been a while. Today is November 22nd, 2023, and the last time I recorded a podcast episode was on August 26th. Needless to say, life has kind of gotten in the way. In part, I didn't have a whole lot of ideas for podcast episodes, which is why it sort of briefly fell to the wayside there. And in part, I was just dealing with a lot of, life stuff. Life has a way of accumulating things that you need to get done. So that's more what I've been up to, trying to focus on that. But now that things have kind of lightened up a little bit, and I have a day off today, I figured why not go ahead and do a podcast episode. And I actually had the idea for it this morning. My intention for this podcast episode, by the way, this one is not scripted. This is entirely off the cuff, me just saying whatever comes to mind. Today's podcast episode is going to be about author's notes. That sounds like an incredibly weird and probably not very interesting topic to discuss, but I promise that it will be more interesting than you think, whether that's only slightly or whether that's massively more interesting. My hope is that it's massively more interesting than you think, or if you already think it's exciting, great, hopefully you'll enjoy this. So, I've thought a little bit about texts that I want to reference during this podcast episode, and so there may be potential spoilers for Carmilla, Dracula, Good Omens, the book, not the TV series, and The Princess Bride. And for that one, I'm referring to the book by, I think it's William Goldman, right? But not the movie. I may end up referencing the show Good Omens and the movie, The Princess Bride, but spoilers would probably be focused more on those books that I mentioned. If you haven't read these books, I would highly, 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 highly recommend reading all of these. They are all incredible and delightful reads. Dracula is a bit long, but it is absolutely worth it to read the whole thing. And it's in light of having actually finished reading Dracula just earlier this year, back in October, that I kind of had the idea to talk about that, and also my experience reading Carmilla. Also, apologies if my voice sounds kind of weird. I have been dealing with allergies lately, and so there's just more nasal drainage and stuff like that, which might make my voice sound a little bit weird. Also, if the sound quality suddenly changes, it may be because I had to actually get up, go clear my throat, drink some water, something like that, just so I would be able to keep speaking in this podcast. Alright, so I think that's been definitely a long enough introduction. I have no idea how long this podcast episode is going to be, but I figure let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so the first book I want to talk about is Carmilla, because I feel like that one, Carmilla and Dracula both really gave me the idea for this podcast episode. I'm also going to say that as much as this podcast is about, this episode anyway, is about author's notes, I'm also going to discuss author commentary, if you will, which would include not just footnotes, but also an introduction or something like that. And I suppose this also applies to editors. So, right. So for Carmilla, just to give you some background, it is the story of this young woman and her father who live sort of out in the countryside, pretty far away from people. One night, I think it's nighttime. Yeah, one night there is an accident where a carriage overturns, and there's this rich lady who is basically unscathed, but her daughter is apparently weaker and more in ill health. And so the lady says she has to keep going on the errand that she was on. But her daughter is not well enough to make the journey, and so the narrator and her father are like, yeah, we'll take care of her. So it turns out this girl's name is Carmilla, and we gradually discover that there are some bizarre things about her. For example, she can't stand the sound of singing at a funeral procession, and oh goodness, what were some of the other things? It's been a little bit since I've read the book. She disappears one night, which is altogether alarming. And also the narrator mysteriously takes ill, and they can't figure out why. Well, it turns out, I'm going to skip all the other stuff. It turns out Carmilla's a vampire, and she has been slowly draining the narrator dry. Once they find that out, or once they start kind of putting the pieces together, an old friend of the family shows up whose daughter had been also killed by a vampire, presumably also Carmilla. I'm pretty sure it's confirmed that Carmilla also killed his daughter. But anyway, he explains to the narrator and her father just what's happening, and that Carmilla's a vampire, and so they eventually go and kill Carmilla, and that's the end of the story, but the narrator is still sometimes haunted by the memory of Carmilla, and Carmilla sometimes appears in her dreams. So, I particularly like this book because it was written, I think, 30 years before Dracula was written and served as some of the inspiration for it. It's really neat to see how the vampire lore sort of begins/evolves, because I believe this is one of the first, among the first more well-known vampire novels. There may have been others. I am not well-versed on the history of this, but I find it quite interesting. So, another reason why I love Carmilla is because it is remarkably progressive for the time, at least in my opinion. It seems pretty clear to me anyway, and I'm not typically one to see these things, if you will, or read too much into it to see these things. It seems very clearly to be a romance story to me, a lesbian romance story between the narrator and Carmilla, and the fact that this, was accepted has, I mean, people just thought, oh, they're such good friends, but it reads very clearly to me as romance. But the fact that it was accepted in the time and everything, despite that, was incredible, and I really like this book. It's very, very well written. The descriptions are very vivid and rich, and my favorite part of the book is where Carmilla shows up at the narrator's bedside just drenched in blood. There's a pretty epic illustration in the version of the book that I read that went with that, and I was like, oh yes, I would love to play Carmilla on stage someday. That would be awesome. Anyway, my point is it's a good book. However, my main issue with it was this edition in particular. I'm trying to remember who the editor was. There was an editor who left notes and things like that and wrote the introduction. Let me look it up real quick, actually. Okay, so I just double-checked my facts, and so this is the version that I read. It had the notes by, I believe her name is Carmen Maria Machado. So she wrote the notes for this, and I read the introduction, and the introduction is mostly what bothered me about this edition of the book, because Carmen Maria Machado wrote an introduction pretending that Carmilla was based on a real story and cited exchanges of letters and professors who had researched this stuff, and a simple Google search reveals that these people aren't real people at all. And so she basically just invented research, and as somebody who considers themselves part of the scientific community and really values scientific work and research and things like that, this really bothered me. Because although she wrote it as sort of something in the style of the time where, authors would write an introductory note claiming that this was based on true events, like she was trying to copy something from the time, it bothers me that she wrote it nowadays when I feel like misinformation and disinformation are so rampant. I mean, yes, it is a literary work, but it still greatly bothers me that that is how she chose to introduce the book, because if you read it without really analyzing it, you're left with false hope that there was actually this lesbian couple that this book is based off of, when in fact she just made that up. And that really frustrates me, because it's not real. Like, I don't mind the actual ones that were written like in the 1800s when the book was originally published by the author themselves. That doesn't bother me, because that was just a thing of the times, and science was not what it is now back then, if that makes sense. Science has evolved a lot, especially in terms of, scientific method and theory and things like that. So it really bothers me that she tried to copy that in modern times when there's so much, when it's easy to just believe things because you read it in a book or things like that, because there are a lot of people out there who don't think critically about these things. But anyway, so it bothers me that she kind of gives the reader false hope, if you don't look into it too much and realize that this is all fake. I don't mind the stuff that's actually done at the time, all of the stuff that's written at the time, because that was just a staple of the writing then. But to do that sort of thing now, it just doesn't sit well with me. I didn't like it. So that was my main big issue with Carmilla. It wasn't actually the story itself, it was with the introduction. Then the author's notes throughout the book bothered me a little bit. There was one note that I did like because it was very poetic in the way a scene was described, or like the note that went with the scene. And so I liked that note, but there were some other notes that were really trying to like push the romance side of things. Like in one description, Carmen Maria Machado said, like, put a little asterisk, like, as the editor's note, next to a description of something that the narrator was experiencing, and said, how can you not think this is an orgasm, basically? And, like, it's not specifically stated that, the narrator and Carmilla are having a sexual relationship. You could, I guess, read into that, but there's nothing explicitly that says that. And just the fact that she's trying to push that narrative when it's already clear just bothers me, because it's like, let this person read for themselves. Let this person, like, understand that for themselves if that's how they want to read into it, that sort of thing. I felt like it wasn't necessary and kind of an annoying intrusion, in my opinion, and there were a few other notes like that sprinkled throughout the book. But my point here on author's notes is just that they weren't beneficial, really, in this case. There was the one that I liked, which, regrettably, I cannot quote to you because I no longer have my copy of the book because I borrowed it from the library. Yay, libraries. So I can't quote that, but it was very good, and I did like that note. But everything else, the introduction, the other author's notes, were just too much, in my opinion. It's like, let the reader form these opinions for themselves. Don't falsify information. Don't just make all of that up. And because that's the other thing. It's not just that it was made up. Made up is totally fine. That's where most of my favorite stories come from. I love the fantasy genre, sci-fi, adventure, action, whatever, and I love when all three are melded together. But I don't like when people are trying to pass it off as real or nonfiction or fact or things like that, and it really bothers me that Carmen Maria Machado did that in her introduction. That is my main issue with it. It took me like 11 minutes to get that point across, but whatever. So that is my main point there. That's really what bothers me about that one. So I'm gonna do something similar with Dracula now. So Dracula is kind of like the most recognized OG vampire novel, and reasonably so. Carmilla came first and doesn't get enough recognition, in my opinion. But the main recognized one is Dracula, and it is very good. It starts out a bit slow. There are pieces throughout the book that read just a little bit slower than others, but I really like how the perspective jumps between different characters and how it's their journal entries and their letters to each other and telegrams that reveal the whole story. There's nobody actually narrating directly. It's just sort of... It has almost a similar vibe to found footage films, where it's, I picked up this person's documentation of their life and learned a story through it. Or this person's documentation of an event and their views on it and how they experienced it. I kind of like that. I mean, not all found footage films are great. Not all books written in this style are great. But when it's done right, I do like this style of storytelling where you just take excerpts from people's personal lives, like their journals, letters, things like that, other forms of communication, and use it to tell a story. I think it's interesting, illustrative, all of that. I think it's good. So I did really thoroughly enjoy reading Dracula. It's quite funny reading it and recognizing all of the horror tropes that we see in modern media in this book when all of the tropes are basically being invented and you're watching the characters and going, how have you not realized that this is a bad idea, especially in the beginning when Jonathan Harker is going to Dracula's castle and all the peasants are crying and giving him crosses and things like that and telling him, don't go, and all of that. But yeah, it is an entertaining read, and there are, although none of the characters are really truly characters because this is a plot-driven novel, not a character-driven novel, it's still a good read because the characters are good people and have just enough characteristics that they pass for being characters, but only barely. And you root for them, and so it works, even though it's a plot-driven novel and it's not my favorite, but not my favorite style of storytelling anyway. I prefer character-driven novels over plot-driven novels, but it was still very good, and I would highly recommend it to just about anyone, especially people interested in vampire lore and things like that. So, to the author's notes. The first time I tried to read Dracula was either last year or possibly the year before that, so either 2021 or 2022. Some friends had recommended it to me, and I was like, yeah, heck, I'll give it a shot. I should read it. It's a classic. So I borrowed a book from the library, but the only version of the book was this ridiculously large copy. So think like coffee table book size, so a large, it was a sizable book. And the reason why it was so sizable is because it was packed, absolutely packed with author's notes. Like, there were whole pages dedicated to author's notes. And so when I started reading it, I kind of got lost in all of the author's notes and, explanations of things at the time, and different customs in the different places that were mentioned, and all of that. And, it's all well and good. I think that, author's notes can be fun and interesting at times and provide insight, and they're especially helpful when you're reading an older text, and some of the things that they did or said back then might not make sense now, and so having those notes there is helpful for the modern reader trying to understand this story that takes place in a different time and in ways a different world as well, and just in the sense that if we were to take this as an actual event rather than a fictional one, the timing was different. But anyway, so author's notes can be great, but in this case, I didn't actually finish Dracula the first time around because I was so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of author's notes. And in this one, again, we had the author trying to push the narrative that Dracula is gay, which I personally did not see. If that is how you choose to read into it, by all means, I am not here to judge that. And I can definitely see where you're coming from. It's just not what I personally read it as. I just don't like when editors, this was an editor, I think I may have said author, this was not Bram Stoker himself making these notes, it was an editor. When editors try to push a narrative or agenda that does not objectively fit into the story, I get frustrated, because it's like, let the reader read this for themselves and see things for themselves. You can put a suggestion, perhaps, that, oh, this seems kind of gay, or, oh, I read this as X, Y, or Z, that kind of thing. I don't mind that. I don't mind suggestions of how to interpret a text, but don't outright tell me this is gay when there's nothing in the text that directly says that it is gay. So, like I said, I have no problem with, like a headcanon or something of Dracula being gay for Jonathan Harker and Jonathan Harker maybe being gay for Dracula. That is fine. But don't, as an editor, tell me that this is the case when you don't have textual evidence to back it up and the text does not explicitly say that or follow that line. That is my main issue, is when editors try to push a narrative on their readers of this book that don't necessarily fit in with the book and may take away some of the reader's agency in deciphering it for themselves or coming up with their own ideas of it. But perhaps that's just me. I'm open to various interpretations of text unless they are just outright contradicted in the text. So I just want to be clear that this is not me hating on anybody's interpretations anywhere along the way. Everybody is welcome to their own interpretations. That is the beauty of art, of literature, of all of that. I'm just saying that don't force your opinion on me. Let me have my own opinions too. I'll let you have your opinions, you let me have my opinions. That is really where my issue comes in. My other issue, as I think I started to allude to with the first time I tried to read Dracula, was that because there were so many author's notes, I got so bogged down trying to read all of these notes that I kind of lost the thread of the story and only ended up making it, I think, 4 chapters in, which is not very far. And I ended up having to return the book before I could finish it. I mean, yes, I had other life obligations, but when you get bogged down reading notes and start to lose the thread of the story, it's not fun anymore. So unless it's a critical analysis of Dracula, I don't want that many notes in my book explaining the book to me, if that makes sense. I want to be able to understand things for myself, and usually when I read, I'm sitting with my headphones plugged into my laptop listening to music. That way I can also pull up Google real quick and just ask it a question if there is a word I don't know, or a custom that I don't know, or something like that, and Google usually has a solid answer to that for me, and I go on my merry way reading the book, now knowing what this thing is. But yeah, author's notes can be frustrating, either because they push the author's editor's notes, can be frustrating because they push an opinion on you, or because there are just too many, and some of them really aren't necessary. In fact, I think having now read Dracula the full way through in a version without any author's notes, I can confidently say that, for me at least, I didn't need any notes to understand Dracula and appreciate it. I did have to Google, I think, a couple of words here and there, either because they refer to something that is now obsolete or because it's just a word that you don't hear that often. But yeah, I didn't really need the author's notes, and so author's notes are also just frustrating when they don't appear to be particularly necessary. So that is most of my spiel, but I do want to discuss a few versions that do author's notes, I think, in my opinion, a little bit better, although I do have some complaints still. We'll get there. So Good Omens is, the novel anyway, is a great example of solid author's notes, because there's no apparent need for the author's notes. They're just little comedic asides that probably couldn't be fitted into the rest of the text without taking away from it too much, and I think that's why those author's notes exist, is because the authors had this great idea for a little comic gag, but then they realized that, oh, this doesn't really fit in the main body of the text, well, let's just make it a footnote. And in general, those little footnotes just add to the comedic value, the humor of the story, and so they're all really good. There are a few where I'm like, wow, that is kind of a long note. It probably wasn't all that necessary, but it was kind of funny, and I still enjoyed it, so that's fine. Whereas the author's notes in the other 2 books, Dracula and Carmilla, were not comedic. They were just there for the editor to insert their commentary, and that was frustrating. And I think that's another key note, a key distinction to make, is authors versus editor's notes. Author's notes are very intentional, I feel, because they're there to contribute something to the story that they wrote, whereas editors are inherently biased because they have their own view of the book. We are all inherently biased. The author, I mean, will have their own biases, but their biases align with the story because they're the one who wrote it. So it doesn't matter so much then when they insert their own opinions, because we take their opinions as canon because they're the author, at least usually. There are some opinions that authors have that I disagree with, but that's probably a whole other podcast episode that we're not going to get into right now. So yeah, I would say that authors' notes are better because they come from the source themselves, whereas editors are inherently biased because of their own interpretation of the text, and I don't know that it's possible to be an unbiased editor unless you are there strictly to provide definitions for words or explain a custom mentioned in the book that you have extensive research on, or that kind of thing. If you're just there to state the facts, great. But if you're there to start shoving your opinions on people, I'm not so much here for it. That's all. And then, goodness, where do I begin with this one? that's kind of all I have to say on Good Omens, is just that they did a good job using their author's notes in an effective way. And I really enjoyed their author's notes because they were funny. And then we have The Princess Bride. And I love the movie. The movie is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's just really well done. It's really funny. It's just delightful to watch. The book that it is based off of, this is one of those rare cases where I don't like the original book more than the movie. I like the movie more in this case than the original book, which is incredibly rare for me, and I think incredibly rare in general, because, we generally respect the source material more than the adaptations, but, that's another thing. So here's my beef with The Princess Bride. So it is a very, very good story. In this one, there is, the author kind of self-inserts a bit in, his introduction and writes a fictitious introduction talking about how he was in the process of divorcing his wife while writing this book and doing research, because here's another case where he claimed that this was based on, an author editor claimed that something was based on history and research and things like that, but it was all fictitious. I guess it didn't really bother me so much because it's very clear that The Princess Bride is a parody of other fantasy adventure stories, and because it's clearly a parody, you don't take the quote-unquote research at face value. You just kind of assume that's also part of the farce, if you will, for lack of a better phrase coming to mind. And so some of the author's notes are funny, but my main issue is that the author claims to be merely an editor, editing the original Princess Bride by the fictitious S. Morgenstern. And so the author's notes intrude a lot on the story. Thankfully, they took that bit out of the movie or relegated it to the child and the grandpa reading the book. But there's just... The author's notes are kind of cynical, which reflects the author's self-view in terms of how he expresses himself and views himself in his own story, in this fictionalized version of himself. So that comes across, but I think it takes away from the story, honestly, some of these introductions. Some of them are comedic, which is why it's okay sometimes. The Princess Bride is really, the book anyway, is really a mixed bag for me, because some of the intrusions are comedic and add to the sort of parody, farcical tone that the book has. But then there are others where they feel really cynical and out of character for the story of The Princess Bride, which, at least in the movie, is a very happy story. It takes some different turns in the book, not altogether vastly different, but overall the tone is just a little bit darker in the book, which I found quite interesting, having watched the movie first and then read the book. So I think that they take away from the fun nature of the book at times, but other times they add to it by being silly and goofy. And so while I love the Princess Bride movie, I have very mixed feelings about the book because of the author's notes posing as editor's notes. So yeah, I think that's probably most of what I wanted to say. To sum up, which I've already said this too many times probably, and you're likely tired of hearing me say this, but my main issues are when the authors or editors' notes, A, shove an opinion on you that is not objectively in the book, because it's an opinion, not objective. When authors' notes are just too many, when there's just too many, and it detracts from the actual reading experience. And C, I would say when they interrupt the flow or tone of the book too much. I would say those are my three main pet peeves when it comes to authors and editors' notes. They're not objectively bad, they're not objectively good. I just think they should be used sparingly and to either add to the lore of the story and the world that it's in, or just to clarify something for a reader who might not know about this one really specific word or custom. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. This was, I think, a satisfyingly long podcast episode. I think 30 minutes is pretty solid because we're coming up on the 30-minute mark here. And yeah, it was really nice just to record another one of these in a very rambly style, because that's just kind of how my state of mind is right now, and that's why I decided to record. So I really hope you enjoyed this, and yeah, sending you all the love.